I have a lot of material I'd like to present, and I started thinking of this as a presentation, rather than the kind of discussions that we often have. But I would like to, all of you probably have received the 2-page paper that I put together from mostly Adyashanti. And that's the core of that will sort of tie the thread of this discussion together. And then I have a number of quotes that I'd like to bring in from other sources to fill out and bring examples and try to bring alive the framework of transformation that this presentation is about. I would like to be able to clarify as we go along if anybody needs something repeated, or wants to ask a quick something for me to try to clarify a point, whether I can or not. We'll see. And Harriet's going to monitor the chat. And if you have actual questions and things that you would like to pursue in a deeper discussion, either write the question to Harriet in the chat or just make note of it. And I could easily imagine this going past 9, but the last while, I hope we can just have bring up these things that seem worthy of discussion. So I'd like to start with something I've came across. I went through a pile of papers. It's like a lot of papers that I've collected over a number of years. Much of it is on these topics that we're going to be going into this weekend. And while I'm thinking of it, I would like to give special thanks to Mark, who's here, speaking in his library. And from that great library has sent us over the years a relentless number of bits of wisdom from all kinds of right and left all over the world, different people, modern and ancient. And I've just been so benefited by having this daily onslaught of at least 5 emails to read. And sometimes I just go and do nothing else during a week but read the Mark quotes, because it really gets me thinking. So some of what I'll be talking about tonight came right from Mark, and especially he'll be talking this weekend about experiences on the path, and some of what I have is to fill out some of this. The theoretical part of it is some of these experiences. So thank you, Mark. I wanted to start with a little quote from Anthony. Anthony always, in the 1970s, oftentimes I would feel like, wow, I'm like really stuck in this box called the ego, and the overself is like, who knows, very far away. And it just seemed like there was such a gap. It's really all these short path teachings that have come out in the last 20 years or something, where we have a better appreciation for the lack of gap. But here's one that touched me. I thought I could start with this just as a way to kind of bring us on the same page, although we already sort of feel very much on the same page. Anthony, there would be a much more spontaneous operation of intelligence, which is the divinity within us. You make this intelligence personal by intruding your reactions and preventing it from freely operating. That's why I point out, if you have faith in the higher, you do not pay attention to the stream of thoughts that is constantly transforming itself from one into another, the senselessness that goes on and on ad nauseum. You just reject all that, and you keep your mind still. I'm not saying that every moment you're going to be inspired with illuminating thoughts that will remake the world. I'm not saying that. But there will occur to you moments where the intelligence will spontaneously respond to whatever the situation calls for. That spontaneity of intelligence is the divinity within you. And right then and there, you'll be experiencing that higher power within you. You don't have to have a world-devastating illumination and the light of a million suns shining to be in the overself. It's so close, but we fail to recognize it all the time. That's our problem. One of the things that fascinated me and others about Adyashanti is that he outlines these 3 steps, these 3 stages or stations as we move from our present situation, which I characterize here as the I am me, our starting point, where we're struggling to become basically conscious of ourselves beyond the identification with the body, mind, the body, emotions, and thinking. And he outlines these 3 stages. I think of them as deepening modes of insight. And I mean to use that word. We can talk about it at some point tonight. I mean to use that word the way PB does. That each one of them introduces us to a different aspect of the overself. And the early 2, the witness and the oneness orientations, because there's this thing called self-consciousness is still present with them, they have a little different status on the way up than the final step. PB distinguishes 2 aspects of the overself, the demi-divine and the transcendent aspect. And I think these first 2 stages, the witness and oneness, are aspects of the demi-divine, but I think they're pointing at aspects of the total reality of the overself. That's not, that in the end is not in relation to the ego, because they're all included. I wanted to kind of go to the back of the book and first read these 3 steps from 2 other sources. One of the first ones, the first one is PB, because PB's succinct, he doesn't expound for hours on this topic. He has, there are quotes throughout the notebooks that apply to it, but in a summary form, he doesn't do it like Adya, talk about the 3 stages, or Adya even relates them to 3 centers in the body, the head, the heart, and the gut. But here's PB. Although the aspirant has now awakened to his witness self, found his soul, and thus lifted himself far above the mass of mankind, he has not yet accomplished the full task set him by life. A further effort still awaits his hand. He has yet to realize that the witness self is only a part of the all self. So his next task is to discover that he is not merely the witness of the rest of existence, but essentially of one stuff with it. He has, in short, by further meditations, to realize his oneness with the entire universe in its real being. He must now meditate on his witness self as being in its essence, the infinite all. And then, so witness and oneness is described here. I had to go to another quote to sort of finish it off. When we come at last to perceive that all this vast universe is a thought form, and when we can feel our own source to be the single and supreme principle in and through which it arises, then our knowledge has become final and perfect. So the witness as, you know, something that's it's a position. It's a recognition that we're not the body mind. We are the awareness, knowing everything else is content. But this is still a kind of duality. We'll go into it a little more later. But then there's this thing of oneness where I am my whole world. And, you know, we talk about in mentalism, how, oh, you know, the cloud 25 miles away, that's our mind. Or my body 25 miles from that cloud, that's my mind too. You know, it's a recognition of how vast our knowledge is, or the knowledge situation is. But there's still in these first two stages, a relationship with what's known. Either I am all of it, or I am the witness of all of it. But in the end, there's this point that PB makes, that there's one over self, knowing the one world image. And that is like the final stage that's being offered, what we could call, supreme enlightenment. So, we don't just go from like egomania to complete enlightenment, like we wake up to the overself and that's it. There seems to be, this graduated development that continues to develop us as we move along. And by the us, I'm referring to, the body-based faculties and everything that we've been developing for lifetime after lifetime. They continue to grow and evolve and clarify and become a suitable vehicle for the expression of the divine wisdom. And it seems to take these stages in order to bring everything into an integral alignment. I'd like to read something from Nisargadatta, who summarizes in an even briefer way these three steps. He says, by focusing the mind on I am, on the sense of being, sometimes it's called the I thought, the simple sense of being. The I am so-and-so, like I'm Jeff, dissolves. I am a witness only. That is, I'm not the content. I am a witness only remains, and that too submerges in I am all, or that's the oneness that's being referred to. Then the all becomes the one, and the one yourself. So I'll just read it again because I broke it up. By focusing the mind on I am, on the sense of being, I am so-and-so dissolves. I am a witness only remains, and that too submerges in the I am all. Then the all becomes the one, and the one yourself. I'd like to mention one other thing. This is a framework, right? We're talking about a framework. We're going to take a journey through a schemata, So, but some of you might have noticed that life doesn't necessarily follow a schemata. On the other hand, these do seem to be, like glimpses seem to be, people have glimpses like on all these different levels. They don't necessarily, you don't have to have like a witness glimpse and then a oneness glimpse and then a no self glimpse. It doesn't necessarily work like that. Adya himself, I think, hit the no self right off the bat, he describes. But there does seem to be something about these three stages as a way that we actually, as a way that the the unit of life, that PB likes to, talk that beautiful quote, the unit of life, the way the overself in conjunction with the world idea evolves, a vehicle that is suitably capable of expressing the faculties of the soul, of the overself. And the higher faculties can't really come on board until the lower ones have matured and sort of fulfilled themselves to some extent. We don't when we come out of the animal kingdom, we don't necessarily immediately start being very rational, so let alone intuitive, and let alone insightful. So these vehicles have a certain natural kind of growth, as we see in nature, everywhere in nature, the natural cycles of growth. And so I think there's reason to think, Adya allows for some freedom in this, but reason to think that our evolution will tend to stabilize, glimpses, whatever, those are freebies in a way. Those are gifts. They're, ways that the divine calls to us. But this, the stability, the developing our ability, say, as a irrational being, living according to our passions, to becoming more rationalized, to becoming more like quiet and intuitive, wanting not to just do what's reasonable, but to do actually what's actually being called for in a situation. And so, these kind of developments, I think, grow in a natural, organic way. So I think there is some reason, and it only can be confirmed by our experience, individually, collectively, whether or not that's so. Adya writes, having a framework can be supportive to your own intuition of where you are going, but the framework does not dictate how unfoldment will happen. If the framework is too tightly held in the mind, and if you're measuring yourself against it, judging yourself, it becomes less useful. So I think that's important to hold in mind, that we each have our own trajectory of development. I'd like to mention the hand-raising function in Zoom, because we have now 61 people, so we're on 3 screens. And if you need me to repeat something, you want something clarified, do the hand raise thing, and then you'll pop to the front screen, and Harriet will see you if I don't, and she'll bring to my attention. So, I am me. I'm going to go to the paper now for those of you that have it. So, the word ego and self, they're used differently in different situations. Generally, ego, we confine this term to the lower aspects of our existence. But there is sometimes in PB there's a higher ego being referred to. And I would say Adya in this context uses the term self to refer to either the development of that higher form of ego, or even like the witness self is a kind of self. There's some aspects of that, there's some aspect of the witness self that we could say is still the higher aspect of egoity. But in this context tonight, I'm going to use the word ego to refer to what's in the quest of the overself, referred to as, the body. I am my body, I am my emotions, I am my ideas. And self is going to be that sense of I am, the simple sense that I exist, I'm here, I'm real. Sometimes they say the one thing that we can't deny is our existence. And so I'm just going to begin. Ego is the me, and it is a psychological process of thoughts, feelings, memories, judgments that arise in the context of desire and aversion. We try to avoid certain aspects of life, and we want other things. This push-pull dynamic is intimate to the ego structure. Our survival depends on it. Ego is the me, and we can distinguish self as the I. Self is the subject of experiences, such as when you say, I feel this, I think that. Self is the sense of I am, that I exist, that I am present, that accompanies every experience. This is what self-consciousness means, but it is usually conflated with contents, at least, in our early stages of growth. When I say my ego, this shows that there's actually a distinction between self and ego. The I is watching the me, and oftentimes judging it. Oh, you shouldn't talk so much. Oh, why did you do, or boy, you were great when you did that. So it's, this kind of, this viewer of oneself. When I say my ego, this shows that there's a distinction between self and ego. I am watching me. However, when ego identification is profound, then I experience my ego as what I am. Then I am what I think, feel, imagine. And I might say, for instance, I hurt myself. We sometimes questers like to say, I hurt my body, or, they objectify, oh, Jeff's talking now, but it feels pretty artificial. But we do have this, we do say, oh, I hurt myself, or I'm stupid, whatever. Consequently, we project this identification of what we think, feel, and so on other people, and we impose this on our world. We say, people are what I think they are, and what should happen is what should happen. We think, life should move in a certain way, not the way we don't want. That's where this context of desire and aversion comes in, is that we're not letting things be as they are, as some teachers suggest we should try to do, or should realize is possible. But we're right in there, manipulating every step of the way. Okay, great. So I want to bring in a couple quotes at this point. This is PB. The idea associated with the body is always I, such as I am the body. We get this same idea with the thoughts and feelings also. Ordinarily, it is the only I we know because it is the only I our experience has told us about. Our bodily I, our felt I, the ideas that we carry and concern us. Where does this personalized sense come from? It comes from that part of us which is deeper than the ordinary self. That part which speaks to us through intuition. That is the overself, which is impersonal. So, the reason we can't deny the sense of I am, the sense I exist, is because this is a constant intuition that's being given to us. It's direct perception. It's not something we have to think about and consider and to be or not to be. Well, that's if we're going to think we can end this, but apparently we can't. It's not something that's up for discussion. I am. So it's an intuition. It's an intuition that actually comes from the overself. That's the source of intuition, as we're currently reading in the sleep chapter on Saturdays, in the wisdom of the overself. So the overself speaks its presence into us as the I am. It's like the overself is like selfing as the I thought. It creates this sense of self, this self-consciousness. And PB in another quote says, if they, meaning us, if we would only stop to think over the meaning and importance of self-consciousness, we might get at a great secret. It develops an acute, growing self-consciousness of the right sort, a constant obsessive suggestion that there is a higher self. So he's saying here that self-consciousness becomes consciousness of the overself. Once we are done obsessing with our self-consciousness about, my embarrassment or my concern about this or that, about the person, about my contents. So this thing of self-consciousness is really the overself calling us, well, you could say calling us back to itself, or it's the means by which it can develop, you know, the ability to discern and discriminate and understand and, you know, come back to itself through the development that we talk about in the unit of life. So that's one thing. And PB, you know, goes through this process very systematically in the quest of the overself, which, you know, there's a class on Thursday morning David Oakley's leading. And there's, in the chapter on the intellect, the analysis of intellect, at the end of it is a very key few pages. And kind of the gem of it, in my mind, the juice of it, is in this short paragraph. He says, "The proper destiny of thought is attained when it comes into the realization that it must itself now be subdued and give place to the subtler faculty of pure attention, directly confined to nothing else but the sense of I. Hence, all extraneous thoughts must themselves disappear before one can proceed any farther into the nature of self. Thereupon," and this is like a beautiful point, this is like PB's like promise to us. "Thereupon, let's say, if you can concentrate on the sense of I am, as Nisargadatta did, only took him 3 years, he says, PB says, thereupon we have the right to expect the hidden self to disclose itself spontaneously." So, yeah, this to be able, I think, at least what I've noticed experientially, to be able to rest in the sense of I am means you don't have a lot of other things pulling you away. You know, you're not worried, like Anthony would say, that you're meditating and then you remember you didn't pay the telephone bill, you know, or, you know, what so-and-so said to you, or, you know, whatever it is that where we're still attached to the contents formerly known as who you were. You know, you're not able to just go into the core experience of selfhood and, in a way, offer that, be there and offer that to the higher. And, you know, you wait in the quiet for the higher, as he says, to disclose itself to you. I wanted to read Nisargadatta's even briefer version of this. He says, "Relax and watch the I am. Reality is just behind it. Keep quiet, keep silent. It will emerge, or rather, it will take you in." So it's this idea that the overself, at some point, will have that shift in the I am from being I am the body, where the I thought is tied to the body thought, the I am the body thought. There's this, if you can hold your concentration on the sense of I am with a sense of yearning, devotion, and longing, PB says, you want the overself, love it. So, you know, you're directing, it's like your aspiration at some point outweighs all of the downward pull of all the other things in our lives. And so even though we haven't completed our long path project of cleaning up our ego and, you know, purification and all kinds of, you know, giving up this and that, supposedly that's going to help. You know, I think at some point the fire of aspiration more than equals the pull of the past, the conditioning. And it can then, this sense of self can be actually shift into the sense of, I'm not the ego, I am the overself. First as the witness. And so that's the next section I'd like to read. I am awareness, the orientation of witness. One of the initial short path instructions is to develop a sense of being the witness, to create an internal distance from thoughts, feelings, and sensations. That is, from the ego. If you are watching, you are less identified. Meditation can be used to watch all the ego activities, to disengage from ego and realize the overself as the witness I. When we wake up from having our identity enmeshed in content, when we sense our center of gravity as being that which is aware of content, that is, I am awareness. When we can sense our center of gravity now is in this sense of I am awareness, thoughts, feelings, and memories can no longer claim our identity. They no longer tell us who we are. When identity leaves the ego, the trance of content is broken. And our sense of self naturally goes back to witnessing, awareness, consciousness, presence. The shift is extraordinarily liberating. You wake up from the dream of me, the dream of ego, and the knot that tied the sense of I am to I am the body has been released or untied. I'd like to read another quote from the Wisdom. This is in the chapter Scorpion of Death, near the end. When we identify the I thought, which always arises first, solely with the body thought, which always arises second, we turn the scale of values upside down and limit the larger factor to the lesser one. Through this initial error, we not only strengthen our sorrows and increase our grief, but also fill our hearts with unnecessary fear. But when we become conscious that we are conscious, I would say that we are consciousness, and that is the most direct thing of our experience, we reach the momentous turning point of understanding the difference between both thoughts, the I am and the I am the body. For the need of making this miracle, and it is nothing less, clear to our own understanding, itself puts us on the right path to achieving it. So there are a few paragraphs like that, first of our thoughts is I, and so on, that are illuminating, but I thought that that one is particularly interesting. And then Adya goes on, actually I'm paraphrasing, but the witness self is the limit of felt duality, because one feels oneself detached from all content. It is very freeing, an awakening in its own right, but it is not the highest experience of self. The witness self will eventually transform to become self as fully expanded, fully inclusive, and we will feel one with all. So we're doing okay here? People, it all feels pretty together and concentrated. Thank you very much. This is really great. I'm going to read a quote from PB about this shift now. We're ready for this shift. And we're going to understand the witness stage a little more, but we're also going to understand this transition to the stage of oneness. PB says, the realization of God in the heart marks the witness stage of ultra-mystic experience. There actually is one of the ultra-mystic exercises, is the meditation on the witness. We feel utterly detached from our own or the world's activities, so much so that we are ascetically tempted to withdraw into a retreat from life. If, however, fate forces us to continue in the world, we will feel all the time curiously like a spectator at a cinema show. But this cannot constitute an ultimate human goal. Well, I tell friends sometimes, when I watch a cinema show, I'm like sucked right in there. And, you know, there's no difference between me and what's happening up there on the screen. I don't even see the screen. But Christy, on the other hand, is a great reminder, because she'll get 2/3 of the way through a movie or a TV show and she says, oh, this plot's terrible. It doesn't hold together. I've had it. Goodbye. I'll see you later. And just gets up and walks away. And I'm like, oh, but don't you want to know what's going to happen? So anyway, the witness experience isn't like this. There's a definite break from that tendency to get lost in the contents of our consciousness. And we know ourselves very clearly as the awareness that's watching. But there is this sense of I am awareness, that the I am is still very present. So this cannot constitute an ultimate human goal. I mean, why not? Some ascetics might like it, but clearly it's not the totality of human potential. So the next stage is that we're in the world, but not of it. It's the return to the external sense world and the discovery that it too is God-born. It's not just the awareness, which is divinity within me, but the world itself is God-born. This oneness stage never loses sight of its unity with life, but insists on its connection with action. It is the realization of all in ourself and ourself in the all. With this attainment, we throw ourselves incessantly into the service of others. So, the Mahayana attitude of, compassionate engagement in our world. Well, I think some of these things I have to share will give us a little more understanding of what's actually this is all about. So Adya has a little more detailed expression of this shift from witness to oneness. And I would like to share it with you because he gives a really kind of an experiential feel for it. He says, when this witness awakeness happened, it hung out for a while in its own rarefied place of emptiness, divorced from human experience. That was a nice place, and it's often a very useful part of one's unfolding to experience this and to hang out there. There's a lot of deep rest, what psychologists call dissociation, total, absolute spiritual dissociation. I don't know if it's dissociation in the clinical sense of the word, but in a certain sense, it is a profound dissociation. Awareness wakes up from form and experiences itself totally independent of form. Of course, it is independent of form. And I want to read something else to jump to. However, in relation to this whole idea of the unwinding of one's own conditioning, okay, like even though the Overself has recognized itself as witness, and we feel now, oh, I am the witness. We still have some self-consciousness in this movement. There's still conditioning. The witness doesn't want much to do with what was formerly known as you. It's kind of messy there. There's all those hang-ups. They don't just go away because you're free of it now and you're watching it like somebody else's baggage. It doesn't just go away. So it doesn't really serve the higher purpose yet of really being able to embody, noble qualities and have a kind of a transformed functioning that can be serviceable to the higher self. So he says, in relation to this whole idea of unwinding one's own conditioning, this distant witness has very little effect on the most powerful elements of our conditioned self. Witnessing certain parts of our own conditioning from the outside is enough for relatively minor or not so deeply entrenched parts of our separateness to melt away. Yet that simply doesn't work for the deep, really core remaining pieces. There needs to be a deeper depth into what is, a yielding to being awake. So it's like saying there's still this sense of separateness and disharmony and so on within the ego complex itself. And there has to be a deeper yielding. We don't want to just hold ourselves back as the witness. We have to yield more into what the total reality. So otherwise, we're just using our awakeness to distance ourselves rather than yielding to what it really means to be fully awake. And then he says, what it means to be fully awake is not to be only fully aware, but to be fully feeling, fully experiencing. So then we come back to this. He says, this was his experience, but I don't think it's so uncommon. He says, the witness is independent of form. Now, it seemed that the witnessing would forever have very little to do with form, and it was very pleased to do so, to be in this condition. But then all of a sudden, this movement away from the ego, it was like actually going around in a circle. It wasn't just like, moving up and out, going around in a circle. He says, when you get halfway around the circle, all of a sudden, the rest of the way, you're going back, back, back. There's a movement, and now this motivation, there's a change of motivation that's happening. Something deeper coming forward in this movement. He says there's a movement of inherent love for everything in the body-mind that had any amount of conflict or suffering. This awakeness inherently has a tendency to move towards unawakeness or suffering, to welcome it back into its true nature. It wants to welcome that sense of separation and the difficulties, the conflicts that are still in the ego. It wants to welcome them back to this sense of to one's true nature, to the sense of wholeness, of healedness. It was nothing that was intended initially, but Adya just noticed it was happening, this movement. It welcomed back, and it would touch everything that was untouched. It inherently seemed not to be satisfied with this grand exit from the world of time and space that the witness was doing. It was satisfied with that for a while, but then its deeper nature brought it back in. This was real deep love. And because he says, it's deep love, but it's kind of like a dangerous love, like, oh, I'm going back where, I was enmeshed before. And there could be some of that sense in this movement. But this oneness movement, it welcomed all remaining suffering within this particular body-mind until there seemed to be very little left to welcome in the sense of inner contractions or contradictions. So this ego formation, in a sense, is a contraction. And that kind of contraction, it has to be opened and released so that it can be responsive to the movements of intuition. And, as long as we have these knots in us, like I'm doing this and now I'm remembering Amota Ma, the open hand of love to welcome those elements of life and in ourself that are, have been in this contracted condition and are suffering. So, and then he ends this up by saying, yet there was another surprise in this movement of oneness. He says the inherent tendency wasn't to just say, well, I crossed the non-existent finish line, I'm an enlightened guy. He said it wasn't satisfied with that, because in oneness you see all beings as yourself. But on the other hand, he says there wasn't the intention, well, now I'm groovy, I'm good, I'm enlightened, I'm going to go help those other people out there who are still displaying a lot of stupid behavior. So he says rather it's more like, oh, this is endless. Apparently, because I look around and there's 7.5 billion people to go. We're going to save all sentient beings, right? But at the same time, there's this paradox that everything is perfect and complete just as it is. In the oneness experience, there's a recognition that the world is the divine world, even in its brokenness. And it's, it has this kind of sense of completeness about it, even though it can become more complete, as they're often quick to say. So he says there's actually then nothing to do. You don't have to have an agenda about saving all sentient beings. Everything is fine. Awake or not, it doesn't matter, whether people are awake or not. This movement was just delighting in spending eternity, welcoming itself. It's like the oneness in you is really the oneness in all. That was what PB was talking about, recognizing, the oneness of all. And you become like a nodal point for this welcoming, to welcome everything back to its wholeness. So I would like to read in the paper now, the oneness section. We've already done a chunk of it, but I think this transition from witness to oneness is it's a really important one. He says, self, we're back to thinking of self as this sense of I am, this dynamic capacity. He says this dynamic capacity can identify with ego processes, and we feel separate, small, defended. I am my body. And it can experience its own subjectivity as boundlessly vast and expanded. So it's the same sense of I am that went from I am my body, mind, to I am the witness, to I am the oneness. And I remember some of us occasionally have this memory of Anthony saying, you can go all the way up to the top, and it can, you're not, until you get to the final stage, the no self stage, can you be free of this tendency of the selfness to expand or contract. We see this in sort of some of the bad behavior of certain teachers. So the highest form of self-identification is I am all, a version of unity. Self experiences itself as oneness, as intimate with all of life, as not separate from anything in existence. It sees itself as the common thread within all beings. Everything is the divine. Everything is God. Everything is self. And I've labeled this as sahaja with residue. And we could go into that a little more, but sahaja is this unity consciousness. But the residue here is this sense of self that's still hanging around. In the next stage, we will have a sahaja without residue. Anyway, I came up with this idea of a residue. I don't know if it's an insult or what, but as oneness, self has a different motivation than ego. Here, the will is to express goodness, love, and compassion without egoic self-interest. In oneness, there is boundless, selfless love without desire for return. It is the stuff that everybody wants in spiritual enlightenment. It is exalted, inspired, peaceful, free, radiant, and a constant experience of the presence of the divine as oneself. When we come into this most profound and liberating sense of self, it is thought to be the highest reality because it doesn't feel isolated, separate, or different. But this is a mistake. I am all is commonly mistaken for the no self experience. Because, if you're so expanded, if you're the whole world, it's often mistaken for the no self experience, which is the falling away of self. In oneness, the falling away of ego and the witness orientations is what allows you to experience this expanded sense of self. So you've moved past this I am me and I am the witness of my experience to this grand, sense of enlightenment, I guess, is the way it's described. Are we doing okay? Are you getting tired of reading? Am I reading? Blah, blah, blah. I think it's okay. Okay, Bob gives me a thumbs up. I'll take that. I'd like to read a few other quotes now first from PB about this oneness experience and something that's very interesting. He says the sage can condemn nobody. He can regard none as outside his range of compassion and can find a place in his heart for the worst sinner. He knows that duality is but a dream and discovers himself anew in all sentient creatures. He knows that the world's woe arises out of its false and fictitious sense of separateness. So this movement towards oneness is a recognition of, the pain and suffering that's caused by this sense of separateness. Nisargadatta says, once you are in this true awareness of oneness, you will find that you love what you see, whatever may be its nature. This choiceless love is the touchstone of awareness. If it's not there, you're merely interested for some personal reason. He says, love is not selective. Desire is selective. In love, there are no strangers. So, it's this oneness, sense of oneness without qualification in a way. And then he says, to see myself in everybody and everybody in myself is most certainly love. I find that somehow, by shifting the focus of my attention, I become the very thing I look at and experience the kind of consciousness it has. I become the inner witness of that thing. I call this capacity of entering other focal points of consciousness love. You may give it any name you like. And then there's this, he adds this thing many of you have heard. Love says, I am everything. Wisdom says, I am nothing. Between these two, my life flows. Since at any point of time and space, I can be both subject and the object of experience, I express it by saying I am both, neither, and beyond both. So I thought about this some, and I think, when he says, when I look inside and I see that I am nothing, that's wisdom. I think one way we can understand this is when you look inside, when you just look at the principle of awareness in us, it's nothing. There's no way to define it. There's no way to distinguish it, like as a separate anything from something else. I mean, maybe Michael Wyckoff can come up with something, a way of reasonably distinguishing it. But, it's known. There's nothing in the knowable world that can define what that awareness is. We could say, well, it's other than the knowable. But at some point, there's no line between that awareness and what it knows. Show me the line right now between that which is aware and what it's aware of. So that's the I am nothing. And the love says I am everything. And he talks about it in this way of actually being able to enter into the interior of another being. I mean, I think some of us have had that experience with PB where he kind of gets right inside of you. Or sometimes Anthony would look at you with those eyes that, you could feel like he was looking right through you. He could see what's going on. Now I'd like to tell you a couple stories about oneness. And these are actual examples, thank you, Mark, of the oneness experience. And they're like a story, This first one, it's almost 8 o'clock. This first one is somebody, we don't need to know much about him, but he was working in a circus. And he was in charge of taking care of equipment, but especially taking care of the circus animals. And so I'm going to cut to the chase a little bit, although it's a bit of a read. I grew to love the animals. I felt a strong connection with them. It was impossible not to, because I was living with them 24 hours a day. I was determined that I was going to understand them wholly for what they were, and realized that the only way to do that was through observing them. So I set my mind to watching and observing every detail, every moment of the day for days on end. After about 3 months, as I became more concentrated on the horses, I noticed that I wasn't thinking anymore. My mind had gone quiet. I realized that knowing and thinking were two different things, and that you could know without thinking. I wasn't forming opinions or jumping to conclusions anymore. I began to do things spontaneously, to live in the moment. I had a strong feeling that I was finally going in the right direction, that this was my path, and I should keep going with this, carry on observing the animals so intently. It wasn't until much later that I realized that the exercise I'd given myself was a mindful meditation. In effect, I was meditating about 20 hours a day, 7 days a week for 3 years, completely absorbed in caring for the horses. It was a life of continual service with no thought of myself. Then it happened. I woke one morning and looked across at the horses, watching the steam rise out of their nostrils the way it does on a cold morning. The next thing I knew, I wasn't just observing the horse from the outside. I was the horse. I was looking inside it. I was it. I could look through its eyes and its mind. I was aware of its true nature. I was aware that all things are one. There was a sense of profound peace within me. It was a revelation. I looked at another horse and another, and I was inside them as well. I looked at one of the dogs, and I saw it in its true nature too. I saw everything in its true nature. I went outside to look at the lions, and it was the same with them, looking from the inside out, not the outside in. We were all the same nature, all arising from the same source. My own nature was just as theirs, in a different form, with one consciousness linking us all together. They were separate in terms of form and structure. It was the same essence, the same emptiness in all of them, in all of us. I went outside to look at the trees, and they were the same nature. Then I looked at my own body and inside myself, and there was nobody there. My normal sense of self had disappeared. At that moment, there was no more anger, no frustration, just a sense of peace. There was no desire, no aversion. Everything was as it should be. So that's from a book, Russell Williams, The Not I and Not Other Than I, The Life and Teachings of Russell Williams. Okay, now I'd like to throw out something from PB, and then I'll read one more story. I mean, there are a number of stories, but I think this could be enough to just confirm that this idea of oneness, where you actually can, like Nisargadatta said, actually enter into other points of view, not limited to just being like from in your own body. You could actually experience the interiority of everything around you. Adya talks about his own waking up to oneness, and he says he walked around his apartment, and everything he looked at, he says, "Oh, I am the chair, I am my wife, I am the lamp, the toilet, everything." You know, it all had that sense, the I am, which up to that point we could think, well, you know, I am the body. We're very body centric. And even when you get to witness, maybe somehow you could think, oh, well, awareness is something like just peculiar to this body. But when you hit oneness, when the sense of I am is, you know, in a way universalized, or at least, you know, it's as large as your life, gives a different perspective on what the sense of I am is, and how it could actually be on the interior of each and every creature. You know, we call it empathy, right? But it's empathy to the limit. So PB in some place says that this is a bit mysterious, but I thought I'd just throw it out there for those that might want to follow up on it. Talks about cosmic vision. He says it's of two kinds. The first is seeing the forms and objects around and feeling one with them. Okay, that's just what we've been talking about. And then he goes on, the second one is seeing only the idea of the universe. He says this is called identifying through worship with Hiranyagarbha, which is like a way of thinking about the subtle form of the universe as part of the world idea, the subtle aspect of the world. He says it is the subtle universe. It's an advanced experience, but not the ultimate. He says so one ought not to stop there, said the professor. This was his, Subramanya Iyer. So that's PB saying there's these two aspects to cosmic vision. And so there's another thing that, thanks to Mark, where I think these two are expressed. And I thought I would read this because it's fun. This is by a person called Bob Berman. He co-authored a book called Beyond Biocentrism. Some of you might know about the biocentric theories. And he's sharing his own awakening experience, which occurred during a stressful time in his college years. Okay, so now I'm going to jump into the story. Now, I was studying for a physiology test when something in the textbook about the visual part of the brain suddenly gave me a split-second insight that the distinction between external and internal is unreal. Okay, those of you that have studied the hidden teaching. Then that intellectual insight abruptly changed into something else. An enormous weight I had never realized I had borne was suddenly lifted. An experience began that no words could convey, but here it goes. It was ineffable and life-altering. The best I can say is that I was suddenly gone, replaced by the certainty of being the entire cosmos. There was absolute peace. I knew with total confidence, not logically, because as I said, Bob, who he was no longer present, that birth and death do not exist, that all is perfect eternally, that time is unreal, and that all is one. The joy was beyond anything I could have imagined. To the marrow certainty could perhaps be better described as a recognition, an ancient familiarity of being home. When the intense initial experience faded, the room returned. So he was reading his physiology text. Maybe we should all start reading physiology texts. He's reading his physiology text, and suddenly, he's like out into the cosmos. When the intense initial experience faded, the room returned and my textbooks laid before me, except all was now profoundly altered. Let's call this the second level of the experience. There was still no sense of a separate me, an observer looking out upon the world. Rather, everything was a oneness, and I was whatever my eyes gazed upon, like I just mentioned about Adyashanti. It was as if my consciousness had previously been long confined, like a canary in a little cage, and that a false sense of being a separate, isolated, thinking individual had now vanished. Objects were no longer separate items existing in space. Instead, everything was the same continuum. When a person came to view, I was this person. The universe was one entity for all time. There were not billions of human beings and animals. There was one living, deathless entity. And he says, I wasn't on drugs. If this sounds fabulous, well, no words can begin to convey the clarity. This experience lasted 3 weeks, during which time no thought flitted across my consciousness, like in the horse story, right? But eventually the ongoing stream of mental chatter of being an individual, an observer, returned, accompanied by a loss of this peace and oneness. It felt terrible. And this article goes on to say, in January 1976, the New York Times Magazine published an entire article on this phenomena, along with a survey showing that at least 25% of the population has had at least one experience that they described as a sense of unity of everything. It's apparently not that rare. I don't know that I've had it. I must be part of the 75%. I want to go to the next step, the final step. God alone is the orientation of no self. When self or self-consciousness or the sense of I am drops away as being our identity, there is no longer a self to whom things are happening. This is all hard to grasp. This is the meaning of selflessness, of no self. The subject is no longer there. So the world of objects disappear as well. Like Ramana What world? You asked about the world. What world? The world of objects also disappears. Knowing yourself as non-dual transcendent awareness, which is the I am awareness, the witness stage, or as the intimacy with all things, the I am all stage. These are states of experiencing that you are knowing or experiencing. These are states that you are experiencing. There's still this sense of I amness about those two stages. In no self, you lose your inner world. This all goes silent. Thoughts, feelings, etc. still arise, but what is thought is never seen as the truth. Quietness is the inner life. Reality is very quiet. Okay, more of this will be explained. It is extraordinarily simple, undivided, undramatic, and challenging to conceptualize. When self falls away, life is not happening to you in any way. Life just happens. Your individuality becomes like any other force of nature, a rock, a leaf. They're just what they are, a profound simplicity. What is beyond self is ordinariness. And you wouldn't exchange this ordinariness for all the wonderful experiences you had before in the experience of oneness. So I'm going to try to bring out some of this, what it means, or at least show you that what Adya was talking about here has support from other sources. PB, the ordinary man is aware of his surroundings. The ordinary man is aware of his surroundings. First, by naming and labeling them. Second, by linking them with the past memory of them. And thirdly, by relating them to his own personal self. The illumined, egoless man is simply aware of them without any of these other added activities. Okay, Adya, another quote from another source of Adya. Actions and decisions still take place, but there is no me thought that is claiming ownership of any of it. This was one of the big surprises, that the outward appearance of a somebody with desires, hobbies, etc., going about their life continues. Responsibility for it is just let go of. It is only the imaginary construction of a me, the one that believed he was controlling any of it, was responsible for any of it, or was involved in any of it, that disappears completely. Enlightenment is the total cessation of an inward-outward perception of oneself. The inward, the me who's narrating, desiring, speaking, vanishes completely. Everything becomes both inward and outward simultaneously. It becomes one. But there is no person left to even acknowledge this when non-duality arises. Life just goes on. There's no big shift or some great final experience. It's the end of the experience. It's the end of the thought self that has been on the journey of enlightenment. This whole perspective of yourself as a me who's been self-inquiring and getting closer just vanishes instantaneously. What's left is pure shining awareness, a non-entity, or we could say the universal overself. This non-entity, living presence, simply is, with no agenda, no interest, no needs, nothing to lose, nothing to gain. The whole great play of life simply arises and falls within this beautiful, silent expanse of awareness. And this awareness is the real you. So I'd like to underscore it with another PB quote. The question of I and of self-consciousness in any form, whether universal or personal, whether it's oneness or I am, me, vanishes when the truth is known, because there is none then to mark out selfhood of any kind. When it is understood that the mind cannot become an object to itself, as is self-consciousness supposes in a way, you become an object to yourself, it will be understood that everything one may say about it will merely impose an illusory limitation upon it. There are no two thoughts, the ego and the universal self, to enter into a relationship in the final stage. So I'm going to read this one again. The question of I and of self-consciousness in any form, whether universal or personal, vanishes when the truth is known, because there is none then to mark out selfhood of any kind. When it is understood that the mind cannot become an object to itself, it will be understood that everything one may say about it will merely impose an illusory limitation upon it. There are not two thoughts, the ego and the universal self, to enter into relationship at this final stage. He says, the consciousness stripped of thought, which looks less attractive to you than the hazards of life down here, is really a tremendous enlargement of what thought itself tries to do. Spiritual advance is really from less to more. There is nothing to fear in it, nothing to lose by it, except the standards and values of the ignorant. I'll read that one again. The consciousness stripped of thought, which looks less attractive to you than the hazards of life down here, is really a tremendous enlargement of what thought itself tries to do. Spiritual advance is really from a less to a more. There is nothing to fear in it, nothing to lose by it, except by the standards and values of the ignorant. You know, when you think about giving up self, fear arises. In fact, it's at this point where the death experience, the psychological death experience becomes very real for some, for many, perhaps. I'd like to read one more before continuing with the paper. This is Bernadette Roberts. I don't know how many of you know about her. She was I don't know if she's still alive. She might have died recently.
She died recently.
Yeah, thank you, Mark. Thank you. I'm just going to read a little piece here about self-consciousness, but she became a Catholic nun, she was very God devoted. And she went through these shifts and changes. And then after about 10 years, she was done. She'd hit, realized the no self. And then she left the convent and married and had children and just went about her ordinary existence, which many say, ordinary life is the Zen life, right? So she actually embodied this. And there's some quite interesting discussion she gives I think it's on the YouTubes. It's like about a 3-hour talk on this movement in an ever expanding sense of self until the point where it just goes. She says, I wish I understood the mechanism of self-consciousness, or how it is possible for the mind to bend back on itself. For if I did understand, I could more easily convey a better understanding of the no self and its most noticeable effect, the silent mind. But whatever this mechanism is, the state of no self is the breaking up of a self-conscious system whereby the mind can no longer see itself as an object. And at the same time, it loses the ability to find any other object to take its place, because when there's no self, there's also no other. I might add that the mind has never had the ability to see itself as a subject. Well, she says, this would be as impossible as the eye seeing itself. Yet I think this very impossibility may be a clue to the type of consciousness that remains when consciousness without a knowable subject or object becomes the whole of it. This type of consciousness is not available to our ordinary way of knowing. And because it cannot be experienced or understood by the relative mind, it falls squarely into the realm of unknown and unknowable. So she tackled with these similar ways of understanding and formulating this situation. So back to the paper. Ego falling away feels good, liberating. I mean, the one of the things about the witness experience is it's very freeing, very liberating. There's a shift from self-centered will and then in oneness to a boundless loving will. When self as a gravitational center falls away, the exaltations of self as oneness also fall away. Up to the falling away of self, there are reasons for what we do. Okay, so this is bringing up the important point about, I think it's basically, you could say, is we feel ourselves centered where we feel our will to be active. Where we feel our will is where we feel our sense of self. So he's going to say here, when self as a gravitational center falls away, the exaltations also fall away. Up to the falling away, there are reasons for what we do. There's motivations. In ego, there are self-serving reasons for motivation. And in the higher forms of motivation, the reasons are to express the qualities such as love, peace, compassion, and unity. That is where the saints live. Okay, we've heard this distinction before about the distinction between saints and sages. When self falls away, these motivations diminish, and this surrender can be sensed as a kind of death. As subjective orientations fade, we stop experiencing life through any medium, life according to me or from saintly values or agendas. Then there is just the infinite experiencing itself from within itself. It is difficult to express no self in language, which only expresses through contrast. There's no longer an opposite in the no self stage to what you are experiencing. It's not love, but it's not other than love. Love has an opposite, as does expansion, radiance, etc. These experiences basically happen to self or ego. They can expand or contract. And we feel that. On a good day, we feel very expanded. On other days, maybe not so. Boundedness and freedom are created by self. Self is one of the infinite's most amazing manifestations. And I added here, it's like the unit of life becoming individuated. And I'm quoting Adya here, he says, I won't make a sales pitch for no self. That's not what gets you to no self. The vital component in this process is, do we want truth for the sake of truth? Or do we want truth for a payoff? Do we want it for its own sake, no matter what it is? Unquote. This intention, which Adya sometimes calls the spiritual instinct. For all I know, Jung's religious instinct might be the same thing, but he just psychologized it. But it's the same force. This intention originates in a place beyond self. No self does not hinder the experience of love, compassion, and so on. It's just not what moves you any longer. So it's like saying the saint has an agenda, noble though it is. And it reflects something about that person's growth, through the kingdoms of nature, through the cycles of individuation, uniqueification, like Avery likes to call it. We become unique expressions of the divine. But those unique expressions in the end don't need us to be there as a self, as a separate, as this kind of sense of I am that can in some way be distinguished from the unity of the pure overself. So it means that the saint might be inclined to operate a certain way, with generosity or some kind of goodness, compassion, whatever. But the sage might see even clearer. I mean, it's not like he sees. The seeing of a sage is much more attuned with the unique experience of the now, of what's actually happening now. And that could look unkind, to the eyes of a saint who's committed to kindness. So, I'd like to read something from, it's mostly Nisargadatta. This is Ramesh Balsekar, who's worked with Nisargadatta, starts this, and then it's a quote from Nisargadatta. Ramesh says, both Ramana Maharshi and Nisargadatta Maharaj speak of witnessing their death. Nisargadatta Maharaj, during one of his usual talks with visitors, stressed that for the full realization of the self, now he's using it in the Hindu sense of the ultimate, we'll say the overself as it is in itself. For the full realization of the self, it wasn't necessary to witness one's own death. I'm sorry, zap that. He stressed that for the full realization of the self, it was necessary to witness one's own death. He said that it had happened to him after he thought that he had fully realized the self. That's what, we read before about it, the oneness stage can be mistaken for full enlightenment. So this death happened to him after he thought he had fully realized the self. And it wasn't until after this death experience that he understood that this process was necessary for final liberation. So here's a quote from Nisargadatta. Whatever I had thought earlier has now changed. What is happening now is that even the slightest touch of individuality has completely disappeared. And it is consciousness as such which is spontaneously experiencing. The result is total freedom. All the time there was complete conviction that it was consciousness which was experiencing, but that I, which the consciousness was experiencing, was there. Now that has totally disappeared. The I am is a thought, while awareness is not a thought. There is no I am aware in awareness. There is an I am aware in the witness, but that's because this residue of self is still present with what the awareness, which actually in itself is the presence of it's an overself. It's a way of describing the overself as awareness. But in the earlier stage, there's still this, we could call it orientation of the sense of I am. Okay, so there's that. And then, let's see. Okay, I want to read another thing from the paper. The source of all these shifts of identity is an extraordinary voidness, the pure, formless overself. Imagine an absolute infinite potential. Everything is this potential appearing, unfolding. What is the highest reality? Adya says, my shoe is just as much the infinite as anything else. To see the infinite in everything is the beauty of the no-self state. It is the substanceless substance of everything, like the universe in a grain of sand. It's like seeing the infinite in each and everything. It is this, as this is lived, one sees that the search for any experience is over with. The great search is undone when all is the infinite. Whether a rock or an expanded state, it's the same infinite. The paradox is that no self, the universal overself, is the fundamental reality of who and what we are. And this reality is continuous with its appearance. This spiritual instinct I mentioned before, which is kind of like it transcends, it's kind of, I don't know how to think, it's like thinking the overself all along put this unit of life into existence, and there are all these faculties developing form and so on, to get to the place where it will wake up to itself from that which thought it was a separate entity until insight happens. Adya says, please understand that it is not you that wakes up. It's reality that wakes up. the truth wakes up. Ultimately, this realization doesn't have anything to do with individuals. That's the whole illusion, that there's something separate from ultimate reality. When it's clear that there's nothing going on other than the ultimate reality, it's a done deal. Enlightenment is effortless. PB, on a similar vein, he says there's this lovely paragraph about insight in the Essays book, but it ends with this statement: for man's insight is mind's contemplation of itself. So it's like that transition place from insight, which is a faculty that comes online at a certain point in the evolution of the human being, is that faculty which is involved with the self-surrender that kind of makes it clear now right through the whole of the unit of life, from, you know, the formless reality down to your tippy toes. It's all like one integral reality now. If there's no such entity, this is PB, if there's no such entity as a me, an ego, you are entitled to ask, who then has this enlightenment? And the answer is the only possible one. It is the void having the experience of itself, or rediscovering itself as it does in each person who attains this level. So it's like saying the overself becomes conscious of itself. It wasn't before in the sense that that's meant. He says this is the spiritual climax of one's life, the dramatic moment when consciousness comes to recognize and understand itself. And Adya says, in a few more words, but in true awakening, it is realized very clearly that even the awakening itself is not personal. It is universal spirit or universal consciousness that wakes up to itself. Rather than the me waking up, what we are wakes up from the me. The overself wakes up, well, words become difficult here. What we are wakes up from the seeker. What we are wakes up from the seeking. The problem with defining awakening is that upon hearing each of these descriptions, the mind creates another image, another idea of what this ultimate truth or ultimate reality is about. As soon as these images are created, our perception is distorted once again. In this way, it is really impossible to describe the nature of reality except to say that it's not what we think it is, and it's not what we've been taught it is. In truth, we're not capable of imagining what it is that we are. Our nature is literally beyond all imagination. Spiritual awakening reveals that which is unspeakable and unexplainable and is actually what we are. And then to bring it right back here, what we are is that which is watching. That awareness which is watching us pretending to be a separate person. Our true nature is continually partaking of all experience, awake to every instant, to each and every moment. And in a way that recalls me back to Anthony saying, you don't have to have a world devastating illumination and a light of a million suns shining to be in the overself. It's so close, but we fail to recognize it all the time. It's what's looking through our eyes. Adya goes on and he says, you know, you might think of these three stages, oh, one's better than the next. Well, in some way there is a progression, but in another way, each one of these realizations is making evident another aspect of what the overself is. Each of these stages, he says, can feel complete in itself, but none are complete by themselves. All three are needed to be simultaneously functioning. The aware space, the great intimacy with life as sacred and beautiful, and no self that proclaims itself to be enlightened. And those of you that are astrologically inclined, I think they actually correspond to this Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto that works in us. I mean, The Uranus is this freeing factor. How we wake up out of old confined points of view, limited ways of seeing things. We get intuitions that expand our horizons, and awakening to the space of awareness in us frees us from being defined by any content whatsoever. The great intimacy of life is sacred and beautiful. I think this Neptune that works in us, it extends our self-sense, our sense of intimacy with the 10,000 things, as the Buddhists like to use this expression, which means with everything. It's the oceanic consciousness that includes everything. And the no-self that proclaims itself to be enlightened, Pluto, or in this, I should say, and no self, there's no self that proclaims itself to be enlightened. This is the surrender of self-will, which PB makes clear happens with insight. There's a surrender of sense of self-will, surrender of self. In the recognition that the wisdom of the world idea is a non-negotiable, like a volcano or a hurricane. When Pluto comes around, there's no negotiation. You can't say, oh, well, I don't really want to, how about if I'll pray every day and you just pass by me this time. There's no blood on the door that's going to save you from Pluto. And I think what it points to is this idea that the wisdom of the world idea is what's really driving this whole process, even through our illusions of self and so on. They're all serving the purpose of developing the unit of life to get it to the point where, as I say, it can become this clear open from formless reality down to the tip of your toes. It can become a clear open expression in a unique way of what is held in the world idea. So it was driving it all along. And when you give up self-will, it's like you recognize, there was never any free will to begin with. But along the way, it was necessary to have that sense because there was development, there was conflicting energies. So one had to be, win out over another after a time. So there is that sense that happens that, there is some kind of freedom. But in the end, we see that the wisdom of God was in charge the whole time. So the witness eye brings out the awareness aspect. The oneness brings out how reality is really continuous with its appearance. It's all one being. And the no self experience is really where you actually now touch recognize the formless ground is recognized as being, I guess, being the real. I don't know. Each of them has their own kind of sense of reality, the awareness, the oneness, and the no self. But when you hit the no self, the other two now become clearly what they are. In other words, awareness is not I am awareness, or a oneness is not I am one with the universe, I am one with God. Those things fall away.